I'm Steve Clemens. I direct the American Strategy Program here at the New America Foundation, and I'm here today largely as a partner, a friend, a supporter of my great colleague Cheryl Schweninger, who heads our Economic Growth Program. And what we're going to do, we've got a great program to sort of talk about the American economy beyond Wall Street and Fannie and Freddie, but to begin to look at proposals, serious proposals, big ideas in New America terms, that begin to think about what can the U.S. do in terms of serious policy options, given the history of these kind of bubbles in the past, given the very limited kinds of tools, particularly on the fiscal and monetary end, what can be done that might have the double whammy effect to some degree of trying to look at the very poor state of American infrastructure today and what you might do to achieve some other broad public goods while dealing with a structural event in the American economy, the likes of which we have not seen in many, many decades, if at all, particularly in the scale of what we've seen. And we have four wonderful speakers. As I mentioned, Cheryl Schweninger is director of the Economic Growth Program here at the New America Foundation, just to my right. He's author of a new report, which is on the internet for those watching, an economic recovery program for the post-bubble economy. Cheryl also recently starred in a wonderful new video with cool graphics, music, high-end stuff. New America is usually scrappy, and we usually don't feed people, so we're upgrading slightly. But Cheryl's Big Ideas video is available on the internet as well. And then to his right, we have Dolores Zimmerman, president of the Praxis Strategy Group, a longtime friend of the New America Foundation who's worked on many, many projects. He's co-author of Rebuilding America's Productive Economy here at New America, and he's director of the Coordinating Center for the Red River Valley Research Corridor in North Dakota. But more importantly, he's been working on something I think we're releasing today, a joint project, joint report by Dolores Zimmerman and Joel Kotkin, whom I'll introduce, called Financing the Productive Economy, the Heartland Development Bank. This, too, is available on the internet website. Joel Kotkin hardly needs an introduction. He and I have known each other for about 25 years. When I was running around in Los Angeles, Joel is, I think, the smartest economic guru, with all due respect to the mayor who I'm going to introduce, in Southern California. He has been writing about economic trends, social trends, talking about both urbanization and the urban corridors and the broadband telecommunications infrastructure challenges of the country. He's author of The City, A Global History. He's author of the fascinating book that I read again recently, The New Geography, How the Digital Revolution is Reshaping the American Landscape. And if you really want to understand what 21st century infrastructure is really about, beyond roads, bridges, etc., read this book. It's a vital piece of that. And we're also honored to have with us Dennis Donahue today, mayor of Salinas, California, former chairman of the Salinas Valley Chamber of Commerce. He is, I think we should talk about mayors in higher office now that you're in Washington. But we're very glad to have someone basically with the real-world responsibility of organizing a city's investments, thinking about infrastructure, and what is going on in the economy as felt on the ground, is felt on the front line in American cities, particularly those that are, I don't want to call them second tier because Salinas is first tier for anyone who's been there, but not the sprawling megalopolises that we often talk about. So without further ado, let me ask my colleague Cheryl Schweninger to take the podium and the helm. And you can clap. I'm going to sit here.
I might note that Mayor Donahue is on the, I think, in the epicenter of the salad belt of the America, the agricultural wide south.
We're it.
We're it. Okay. And I hail from the Corn Belt, so we have both wings of the agricultural heartland represented here on this panel. Really, the discussion today here is to mark the celebration or launch of what I hope will be a whole series of new targeted financial institutions, even as we note the death of many of the hallowed names on Wall Street. And I'm not sure what the latest news on Lehman Brothers, but I understand it is being being bought, so it falls to some degree. Bear Stearns and Fannie and Freddie has been reduced from a private with some GSE-sponsored status to being a conservator of the government. So we're rearranging, as we speak here, we're rearranging the financial architecture of the American and indeed in some ways the world financial system. Now, what I want to do in my opening remarks is to put the proposal for the launch of a Heartland Development Bank in this somewhat larger context of the housing and credit bubble and the shifting nature of our financial architecture from the time we began the bubble era, approximately 98, 99, 97, 98, to the beginning of what we can now see as the beginning of the post-bubble era, which will unfortunately be fairly long and painful in its making. Now, as I said, I think one of our goals and one of our purposes in the economic growth and one of our purposes in supporting this initiative is that we see the need for a new layer of government-backed, targeted financial institutions for the post-bubble American economy. Institutions that can get capital needed where it's needed most and will have very productive outcomes. So we're going to, under our vision, we're going to see fewer Bear Stearns, fewer Lehman Brothers, fewer IndyMacs, and we're going to see more proposals, more institutions along the lines that are going to be described by Delore and Joel, the Heartland Development Bank, or have been proposed by my colleagues Heidi and Doug Redeker for a national infrastructure bank, which I think their idea is an advancement over some of the bills that have been pending in Congress for the last year. One could also, obviously, an energy development bank, as well as some of these state industrial banks that are beginning to develop. In other words, we're beginning to see and understand that the financial architecture is changing, needs to change. Now, I think the kind of institution the Heartland Development Bank will be would serve two very broad purposes. One, as I said, is to provide capital for the real economy, to get capital where it often hasn't always been willing to go on a long-term patient basis. Even during periods where there's been great liquidity and low interest rates, there's been some parts of the economy which could have provided the demand for usable capital, but for reasons the way Wall Street has operated has not received capital. The other broad purpose, which I'm going to briefly outline here, is the argument that this layer, this new family, this new pillar of financial architecture, these more targeted development bank kinds of financial institutions would make our financial system, our financial architecture stronger and more stable and less subject to the bubbles and financial crisis we've seen over the last 15 to 20 years. Now, many commentators, in fact, the great majority of commentators, have seized on and blamed the crisis on deregulation and increasingly loose and even predatory lending standards and practices. Well, deregulation is part of the story, but I think, and we do need to re-regulate the financial institutions and our financial systems in a constructive way. But I think it actually misses the larger causes of the current crisis. And I say this because the housing bubble was not limited to the U.S. housing market alone. In fact, there were, by measuring prices, and overbuilding, there were even larger bubbles in Britain, in Spain, in Australia, in New Zealand, and even in France. So I want to point out that I see the crisis as a reflection of sort of two fundamental problems: a mismatch on the supply side and the demand side of finance that helped contribute in a major way to the bubble. On the supply side, we had, in the aftermath of the Asian and Russian financial crisis, a huge explosion of global savings. The global stock of savings, as a Morgan Stanley study measured it, went from approximately $6.5 trillion of global savings in 1999, 98, 99, which had been relatively steady for the previous 5 to 10 years, to $13.2 trillion in 2007, with the largest increase in spurt coming in the 2004, 2005, and 2006 period. Now, this, Ben Bernanke, called this the global savings glut, and Greenspan also alluded to it. But study by Morgan Stanley much earlier actually did a much better job of heralding this problem. Now, essentially, there were three sources of the great explosion in the supply of savings. There were the old high savings societies of old Asia, Japan, and old Europe, Germany. But then suddenly we had emerging Asia, which exploded beginning in 2001 and 2002. And that was mostly because of China, which increased its savings from about 32% to nearly 50%. So that you had an overall increase of excess savings in Asia. The savings rate went from about 31% to 34% in a few years' time. Then, when you got the oil crisis, and you also got the petrodollar state surpluses, the surpluses of the Gulf producers, but also of Russia and a number of other countries. But China, of course, is a big story. It has $1.8 trillion, more than $1.8 trillion in foreign exchange reserves, probably $2 trillion, because it's adding a pace of 50 to 60 billion dollars of foreign exchange reserves every month. But its current account surplus has gone from 1.3% of the surplus in 2001 to 10.6% of GDP in 2007. That's unprecedented. So we had, on the one hand, this huge increase in supply. On the other hand, we had the American financial system, which was both by policy but also by default the system that was going to recycle these global savings surpluses and intermediate them into the world. Here, the U.S. financial system was very weak in creating effective demand for those savings, meaning effective demand in finding long-term investments that had reasonable risk and didn't and provided a long-term sort of portfolio. This was taking place at the same time that you had major revolutionary changes in the U.S. financial system and model that was made possible by the creation of the various exotic instruments that allowed you to slice and dice and create collateral debt obligations and other acronyms that I won't bore you with. So we had a financial system that became very, very deep. Very, very deep in the sense there was a lot of money, very, very deep in the sense of the layers of sophisticated instruments, but actually, paradoxically, was becoming very, very narrow. Following the tech bubble, the range of viable investment options and business models that investment banks had increasingly revolved around the levies, if you will, of the household, housing, real estate, and mortgage sector, in which you had this combination of government policies encouraging and providing assurances, whether it was from the tax deduction of mortgages to the role of Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac. But you had investment banks that suddenly found their new business model slicing and dicing mortgages, which then allowed for even more leverage because originators could easily get their mortgages off the books and provide more. So you had a huge gusher of global liquidity that was channeled through an increasing narrow demand for viable investment in the mortgage and a reach, because of the huge amount of global savings, pushing down interest rates, but more and more money going into the mortgage sector and the business of slicing and dicing mortgages. Meanwhile, it's sort of the classic case: water, water, water everywhere, but not a drop to drink. I remember in the period 2002, 2003, 2004, it was extremely difficult to get financing. Whatever you think of ethanol plants, it was extremely difficult to get financing for ethanol plants out in the Midwest before the ag boom and before the latest. It was even more difficult to get any money for new infrastructure. A national gas pipeline set standing for 10 years because they didn't have effective capital in large parts. No money for transmission lines. Now, part of this was a failure of public policy, but it was also a function that our financial architecture had become very deep, very leveraged, but increasingly narrow, and couldn't handle the flood of global savings. Now this is, now it's created, it's forced the levees have burst, and now we're trying to create a new financial architecture that actually will both be more stable, stronger, but as I pass off the baton to Joel, will actually serve the purposes of making important, productive investments in our real economy with reasonable risk and long-term, and the prospects of good long-term returns. Joel.
Thanks, Cheryl. Well, just a little thing about California, and about 50% of our job growth in this decade came from real estate. So when you're wondering why our economy is in the trouble it is, we have a state that has, I think, in terms of human and natural resources, the most of any place maybe on Earth, and yet we're in the depths of a terrible recession, in part because money was not available for our productive economy, but was available for speculation. I think Mayor Donahue may be able to talk a little bit about that, particularly since he's got to live with a wonderful state of California budget that is still not done. But I'd like to talk a little bit about where I see there is an opportunity, and I think that one of the things is that I think a lot of the media in this country have this completely mistaken idea of what's going on in the heartland. Just an article in the Wall Street Journal recently about people in the countryside, how are they so stupid? Why do they vote for the Republicans? The heartland is in a terrible place of empty cities and empty towns. Well, there is an element of truth there, but actually the central part of the country is actually in many ways doing relatively well. It's not this kind of postmodern environment, the lost world of emptying towns, meth labs, and militant Native Americans who are about to recall the place, and that the best policy should be, let's turn the heartland into a park. And the thing is, when you spend a lot of time there, which I have, you're amazed at what is going on there in terms of the vitality, and then thinking about what it could mean if we could somehow increase the productive capacity of that part of the country. It is, as a journalist, it's always easy to go to a small town, and here's the last person left, and And here's the coffee shop that's closing because there's nobody there. But then it's not so interesting to go to a place that's reviving and to understand what's going on in the heartland and what it means for this country, particularly in the thing that I've been working on for over 2 years. We begin to have another 100 million people in the next 30 or 40 years. And how are we going to accommodate them? How are we going to create an economy so that their standard of living doesn't go down? And how are we going to live without having to live on top of each other? Some people like that, but most people don't. So I think the idea of the Heartland Bank is really based on the question of what a great opportunity it would be for the United States over time. And I think there are going to be a lot of areas that I'm going to try to go very quickly. Obviously, energy, a high value-added fields, including high technology services, communications, a lot of very sophisticated manufacturing, a lot of which is exported, is in these more rural areas. There's warehouses, there's a lot of different activities, a lot of which is being driven out of not only cities but suburbs for land costs, and also because of the fact that many of these places can no longer house the population that can work even at $10, $15 an hour. They just can't make it in a large part of metropolitan America. So these other places become more important. So in that way, I think revitalizing the heartland is very important in terms of helping Americans reach their aspirational dreams. The idea that maybe they might be able to own a house, the idea that they might be able to send their kids to a decent public school, many of the things that are becoming very problematical in our urban areas. This is the historical American pattern. Americans would, immigrants would come into the great urban areas, and then many of them would say, well, I want to live a better life, and they would go somewhere, including moving out further out. And I think that's really the essence of a great part of the American story. To me, the American story is the two big themes are the movement to the West and the movement of immigrants to the United States. And these things are some things that are obviously related to each other. Now, the other thing is to think of this strategically. The United States has the greatest expanse of arable land in the world. On a per capita basis, its endowment is far richer than any of our competitors. It's very always kind of funny, when you talk to people on the coast, and of course I live on the coast too, and they say, "Oh, we're running out of land," and they even say, "We're running out of land in California." Then drive through the southern part of the Salinas Valley, and you can see that there's a lot of land left. But Cheryl has a better solution, which is to take a plane into the middle of Nebraska and have them drop out, I guess, with a parachute, and then realize how empty a lot of this country is. So I think what we need to do is understand that as we have a population growth, we still have this resource to help accommodate some of that growth and in a humane way. Interestingly enough, over the last 30 years, there has been some loss of farmland, mostly for recreational pasture, forest, and other non-urban use. But the amount of cropland has been relatively stable, and there seems to be about as much or more open space available to the public. I think there should be more, but we're not running out of space, except to some extent in some of our very crowded urban areas. So what's going on in these other areas? Let's first deal with the farming issue. About 10% of the people in the heartland live on farms. About 14% of the workforce is involved in agriculture, so it's a very critical sector. When we work with Mayor Donahue in Salinas, one of the things that we've been saying is trying to understand what is the competitive advantage of Salinas. It's no question it's high value-added agriculture. Out of that, all the other higher-end jobs are generated. So in many, many places, it's still the key. The question is, how do we drive this up, further up the value-added chain, both in terms of selling that technology, but also producing the best crops and the safest crops. There's a lot of competition we're going to have in the agricultural world. Brazil, Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan are all investing in agriculture, and we have to continue to move up the value-added chain. We're seeing, for instance, in the Salinas Valley, areas that may have been previously in crops or for cattle now going to wine, which is a higher value-added crop besides more fun to drink. But I think you also look at what's happening on the energy side, and Dennis will talk, I think, a little bit about this, but we have a history of using our agricultural methods to meet an energy crisis. In the Second World War, farmers responded to incentives. They created the fats and oils that were indispensable for making war materials such as explosives, paints, soap. So, I mean, we have a history of, under an intelligent government, of being able to meet some of these challenges with some, relatively simple incentives. And I think we can do the same thing with the biofuels. And one of the things that we've talked a lot about in Salinas and in many of these communities is not so much this idea that we're going to build these huge ethanol plants or biomass plants and we're going to ship the stuff out, is to use the stuff locally. I mean, one of the things that I think we're going to see in a lot of these communities is, like, for instance, there's a lot of agricultural waste in the kind of products that are created in Salinas. Maybe we can create biodiesel that's used in the area around Salinas, and that has all sorts of good environmental effects as well. Of course, then we're not increasing the demand for products created by people who hate us anyway. So that always has a nice ring to it. But this is only one part of the future. One of the things that's missed in this, what's the matter with Kansas kind of view of the world, is that it's not just agriculture, although agriculture is actually doing reasonably well right now, is that these places are, these heartland communities are becoming very, very attractive to lots of populations, among, of course, the wealthy, the Ted Turners of the world. They're going to places like Montana. There's a significant group of downshifting baby boomers who are now moving to these smaller communities for all sorts of lifestyle reasons. But I think we're focused a little more, not so much on those kind of communities, but on going beyond the amenity-based economy, because I think you create this kind of golden rust bucket, and it's really not a very pretty picture sometimes. If you go to like a Jackson Hole, the working people in Jackson Hole have to come from Idaho because there's literally no place for them to live. That's not sort of the vision of the heartland that I'm particularly enthusiastic about. But there is a really brighter piece of this, and I'll talk a little bit about North Dakota. When I first started talking about North Dakota, of course, immediately the Coen brothers came up and everybody was making fun of me. What are you doing in North Dakota? Even people in North Dakota would say, what are you doing in North Dakota? And I have to say it was a little bit tough at first. The coffee was really bad. I used to have to take my coffee from L.A. And the food was pretty bad, and, it could be a little depressing. But it's amazing what a growing economy can do. There's been a huge growth in the area around Fargo, where there's been the development of high-tech industry. They have very well-trained workforce. They have extremely high school graduation rates. It's a very good place to do business, and it's got a very, in many ways, a very progressive climate on a lot of levels. So now, 10 years later, Fargo has a first-class boutique hotel and a clothing store that appeals to metrosexuals. Something's happening in these places, and we think there are many places in the heartland where this is happening and can happen, but many times they have a problem with infrastructure. One of the big advantages, one of the most critical parts of infrastructure, which Steve talked about, is that of the internet. It's very hard to exaggerate what the difference the internet and to some extent cable television has made in cutting the isolation of these rural areas. I used to do reporting in the old days in the Great Plains, and you would get a beaten-up Wall Street Journal 2-3 days late if you were lucky. Today, you can sit in a small town, get on the internet, and you can get the same information that some guy at Lehman Brothers, who's losing billions of dollars daily, is getting as well. So, you might not have as much ability to screw up, but you certainly have the same information. And this is a big change. Marx talked about this, what he called the idiocy of rural life. Well, that's not so much the case anymore. I mean, people in these parts of the country, farmers in remote communities, know more about what's going on with weather patterns and commodity prices than the most sophisticated traders. So I think we're seeing something very dramatic happening. What we need to do in order to make this really work and to see that 100 million people, to see if we can get 20 million people to move to the more rural areas, well, then means maybe that there'll be fewer people in Los Angeles, for one thing. And we really don't need to pile everyone on top of each other. So I think that the question is, how do we take these assets? There are many things that are going for these communities. They have, first of all, very low price of land. The cost of living is low. They have really good public schools. I mean, whenever I talk to Delore and other people from North Dakota about the struggles of a parent with two young girls in Los Angeles, it's just like I'm talking about a completely different country. I mean, everybody in North Dakota pretty much goes to the public schools. The president of Microsoft Business Systems and the mechanic who fixes his car. There's something very attractive about that. And we've had very strong employment growth in this part of the country. A lot of the industrial growth in this country is taking place in these smaller communities. And we've also been beginning to see, in many ways, a pattern of migration among non-immigrants in particular, but increasingly immigrants, moving from not just cities, but also from suburbs to smaller communities. So the big movement in America today is to smaller cities and smaller towns. Still, the very small towns are losing population, but you get over 50,000, and most of them are gaining population. So I think there's by 2010, in this decade, maybe about 5 million people will leave the larger urban areas for smaller areas, some of which are down to about 50 to 100,000 people. So we have this new pattern, we have this new opportunity, and what I would like to do, just in turning it over to Delore, is what do we need to make that work? Well, I think we have very good historical lessons in the United States, and that is you have to build an infrastructure to make it possible for industry and people to live and to function. Some of it is electronic, some of it is what Delore will explain, infrasystems, ways of creating an opportunity for innovative industries, but a lot of it is some basic stuff, canals, turnpikes, railroads, highways, which really played a critical role in the past. I think most of all, on our website, newgeography.com, we just did a special on the 75th anniversary of the New Deal. And we think about what the New Deal did, and Delore wrote about his hometown in North Dakota, in a small town in a very rural area, and about how the New Deal really provided the infrastructure for that town. The great achievements that we were able to make during the New Deal, taking regions of the country that were basically semi-feudal and turning them into productive regions with not just with very high-end agriculture, but also with very sophisticated industry. We can do that again. I mean, we did it in the 1930s. I don't see why we can't do it again. So what we ultimately have to come up with is an investment strategy. I mean, we have been wasting billions, tens of billions, maybe hundreds of billions of dollars on nonsense. We have cities that have no industry and poverty and dysfunctional schools, but they have plenty of money to build baseball stadiums and convention centers. We've been pouring money into second homes and into speculative real estate investments instead of doing something worthwhile. And so what we're trying to do is figure out a mechanism that will revitalize at least this part of the economy, the rural economies, because the potential's already there. We're not talking about let's rescue the little small towns that are all going to die and blow away and, oh, isn't that a horror? We're talking about something that is already happening, that's already cresting, already beginning to become a reality, and how do we make it become a reality faster so it helps more and more of our next 100 million Americans. And I think these towns are important for the very essence of the country. One of my favorite historians, Frederick Jackson Turner, talked about these kinds of communities as the incubators of that restless, nervous energy, that dominant individualism, that buoyancy and exuberance which comes with freedom. And I think in the next 20 or 30 years, and with another 100 million people, we're going to need that spirit more than ever. Thank you.
Afternoon, everybody. Joel, as you can tell, is a real champion of the Heartland, and it's been really nice over the years to see that he doesn't have to bring his own coffee anymore. And he used to, Pete's Coffee, which was very good. My thanks to the New America Foundation. They supported the early Heartland strategy work that we did, in which the idea of the Heartland Bank surfaced. And since then, we've been trying to flesh it out, and we're currently in the design stage for that. And I appreciate the venue for talking about that today, Cheryl. The Heartland strategy that we developed in 2006 was really the fundamental basis for this, and what we looked at were these emerging growth centers throughout the Heartland that really were taken off, and a critical ingredient of that was the infrastructure that was going on. And as you can see in the report here, we take a rather expansive view of infrastructure. It's not just roads, it's not just highways. It's really those things that create interoperability with the broader economy. It's those transactional systems like multimodal shipping. And then it's also the innovation infrasystems that are so important to the kinds of growth that we're seeing. In my own background, we have the Red River Valley Research Corridor, which is an initiative spearheaded by Senator Byron Dorgan. We've really made strategic investments in all kinds of research and production activities in energy, nanotechnology, life sciences that have really created some exciting new things. And I can tell you, there's a research park in Fargo right now, which 6 years ago was a cornfield. And today it probably employs 700-800 people in very advanced fields. So you can do this in a very quick time if you make the right kinds of investments. In Bismarck, a couple hundred miles from where we're at, we have an advanced multimodal shipping center. Other areas around the country that we're familiar with, Wenatchee, Washington. Wenatchee really went out on a limb. They built this tremendous technology center, which tied in with their cheap power, their high-speed optical telecommunications, and they were able to land a Yahoo data center there, which is a pretty phenomenal facility. In Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, they have the Burrell Business Park, another example of where critical infrastructure in water, waste, energy, and telecommunications really made the difference. So the point is, our departure on infrastructure was not the inadequacies, but the success stories that really led to higher value opportunities and higher income jobs. Places where infrastructure really was a driver of innovation and economic growth. Now, as we began to dig into the subject of infrastructure, it was very hard at first to find examples of where deficiencies in infrastructure were commonplace. That's not the case anymore. Almost on a weekly basis, we see where problems are emerging with our infrastructure that are really creating bottlenecks. Highway, railway, waterway blockages are keeping crops that could be exported on the ground, in many cases spoiling. Energy from renewable and fossil resources in the heartland can't get to the large metro centers where the demand is because we don't have the transmission. Wireless telecom isn't what it could be yet. You can drop a call, unfortunately, in many places. But we also need those high-speed optical networks that the universities and high-end users really need. Another thing about many parts of the heartland is the electric power grid, as in many urban areas, is woefully inadequate. Joel and I were in a community in a part of the heartland last week where they have a very advanced membrane manufacturing facility that does filtration of very complex products. They have to shut down occasionally because the electric system just can't handle it. So not a good way to build an advanced economy if you can't even keep the lights on and your machinery going. And then like their urban counterparts, second and third tier cities, very small towns, have a backlog of infrastructure improvements that they need to make, and they have unmet future needs, and I know that Mayor Donahue will talk about that. So we all know that infrastructure is on everybody's radar screen today. It's the #1 problem. It's everybody's solution. We got a tremendous challenge. I think the estimate is $1.6 trillion of work to do. We're aware of these proposals at the federal level for an infrastructure bank, a bonds program, development corporations. We also know that states have infrastructure funds and public authorities that they're talking about. And then we're also seeing the springing up of private infrastructure investment funds around the world, and those have really taken off in recent years because investors are now seeing that as an asset class that has an attractive risk-adjusted return on investment. That's kind of the phrase I hear whenever I talk to the investment funds. We're also finding around the world, and here's where the United States is a little bit behind the curve, that public-private partnerships to finance infrastructure are relatively common elsewhere. just beginning to emerge here because government simply cannot do it alone anymore. Government's not going to be able to afford to do this. So this is kind of the origins of the Heartland Development Bank, and as we began to look at it, we really thought about it as a bank that would help to enhance our competitiveness and promote economic growth. The model that we first looked at was to structure it somewhat like the International Development Bank, where you had a variety of public and private investors that would come to the table. 5% of the capital would be paid in, the remaining would be called in when there were deals to do. But the primary thing that we were looking to do is to create a mechanism that would invest in infrastructure in parts of the country that have been traditionally overlooked, as both Cheryl and Joel have remarked. Now, I'm not complaining. I really am not, because part of the problem is we haven't put those mechanisms in place ourselves to actually get the investment. So we need to be more proactive and take the initiative. Now, since we did the Heartland report in 2006, we were able to acquire some very much needed seed money from the USDA's Small Business Innovation Research Program. And what we've been doing with those resources in recent months is looking at how would we design this, who would be our partners, what would we focus on, what would be our investment strategy. And right now we're in very serious discussions talking about three possibilities. One is to actually start a bank. Other people have told us that we don't have to start a bank, we can partner with a bank. And then we've thought about totally ignoring the bank situation and just being a packager of deals and then going out to the existing funds and raising the money that way. In terms of capitalization, we've talked to about 20 of the private infrastructure investment funds. Many of them are looking for deal flow. Many of them have 70% of their assets still waiting to be invested somewhere. They're very interested in what we're doing. And there's plenty of models to look at around the world, so we're trying to get a handle on what the best option might be. And we've also seen, now that we're in this talking about infrastructure, we get invited to speak at regional and local conferences on infrastructure, and inevitably after every talk we give, somebody comes up and says, we invest in that sort of thing, and if you put this together, we want in. So that's been very encouraging. The other part is not only to be an investment vehicle, but as many of these funds around the world are, they also take a role in building, designing, and operating. So we're also talking with engineering firms throughout the Heartland that might want to partner with us so that we could build it, design it, and build it, and then we might operate it as well. So that's another facet of the things that we're looking at. In terms of an investment strategy, we really believe, based on our work with these emerging growth centers, that our focus is going to have to be on a limited or a select group of regions at first, because what we want to do is make investments in a broad range of infrastructure, the public, the basic stuff, the connectivity type of infrastructure, and then also the innovation infrastructure that can make these higher value opportunities occur. That'll lower our operating costs and minimize our due diligence, but I also think we're going to have a greater impact if we focus on regions like that. And the other important thing, if you look at the document that we provided with the V, you can see that while infrastructure is important, the real keys to making these things happen, to making these advanced developments occur, the congealing force is really leadership and having an idea what kinds of things you should be doing economically. You got to have a strategy, you got to have a vision in order to make these things happen. And so what we're looking for is cities and regions that have those characteristics. Because if we only focus on infrastructure investment in terms of miles of roads, number of bridges, construction jobs that it's going to create, we're going to miss the target. Because what we really need to do is have a development bank, a development strategy that's going to create these advanced opportunities that are going to build us a more promising future. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mayor Donahue, because he exemplifies Joel and I have been working in Salinas for about a year and a half now. Mayor Donahue exemplifies the kind of leadership, the kind of strategic, forward-looking vision that we look for in partnering with communities. So, Mayor Donahue, it's over to you.
I'm going to quickly add a little background and a couple of mayoral disclaimers. First of all, when you see mayors in more ceremonial type of settings, they often lean over to somebody, and what they're very quietly saying is, "What would you like me to say and for how long?" And the reason I bring that up today is when I did that with Delore and Joel before I got here, they said, "Just play off of us." So I find myself in the very difficult circumstance of having to be a political person who must both think and talk at the same time. So, but the other thing I want, just a little bit of background of Salinas and why Salinas. Just if you don't know where it is, we're about 100 miles south of San Francisco. If you're like my daughter, she never likes to say I'm from Salinas. I'm really from Monterey. So we're about 10 miles as the crow flies away from Monterey. But one of the reasons Salinas, I think, is an important city and area to talk about relative to this particular conversation is, and I found this out much to my surprise, Salinas is the 150th largest city in the country. And it is probably the quintessential laboratory for where all social ills attributed to urbanization meet all things rural. So every social challenge, frankly, in this country plays out in Salinas. And in fact, one of the things I tell folks about Salinas, what's interesting about the city of Salinas is our economy is in the valley. As one of our former downtown merchants once said, in Salinas, you are either in agriculture or you are a parasite of ag. And however inelegant that may be, it's factually true. So the reality is John Steinbeck's long valley that runs some 90 miles, in the city of Salinas, the financiers, the accountants, your retail sales tax base, that's how we keep score. And so it is, and we also sit in the middle of the world's 8th largest economy, though these days I'm not sure what that's worth given the state of budget issues. But as I often tell people when I put on my Chamber of Commerce hat, think about Salinas. We are arguably 20 minutes away from the most beautiful meeting of land and sea in North America, if not the world. We lie 60 miles south of arguably the greatest economic engine the world has ever seen, the Silicon Valley. Yet, and we live at the end of the old order of perishable agriculture as we've understood it in our valley, giving away to the new that Joel described. It is no longer safe to rely on commodities. As one of my relatives said, that the strategy of the garbage can is the letter shipper's best friend. That train left the station a couple decades ago. And I also want to point out, and I really want to make 3 points playing off of the comments that you just heard, just to give you a little additional context. I'm the proverbial salesman married to a farmer's daughter. In Salinas, being the mayor is a part-time job, wink, wink. And I'm also, so I run a produce company. I have the proud distinction of being the world's largest radicchio grower, which is, believe me, much different than being the world's biggest lettuce grower. But I also am the current sitting chair of the Grower Shipper Association of California. So this issue of understanding ag and its future, and then and I'm really an accidental mayor. I stumbled into the mayor's office just trying to help save a few libraries in our city. So I really bring a business, I think I bring a business perspective to the mayor's office. And what I think is really important about this idea, it may need to be tweaked. It obviously will have to be subject to whatever the whims of the marketplace are, as it were, but this notion of a new layer in conjunction with government is really important. Let me tell you about infrastructure in my state. It's perhaps a little different because in Monterey County we do land use wars like it's nobody's business. The food fights are superb. It's taken us 8 years to not have a general plan in Monterey County. So that whole notion of environmental jihads and all that sort of stuff, it all plays out in Monterey County. And so I'm often frustrated by government. So here's what we're facing for the third time in November, something called Measure Z, which is a 1/2 cent sales tax countywide for the purposes of some 25 different infrastructure, transportation-oriented improvements carefully crafted amongst the 12 cities in Monterey County. So it would be a combination of everybody gets a touch. It's politically correct, designed to appeal to all of the elements to get a 2/3 vote. And recognize 30% will be against it from the beginning because it's a tax. Now in Monterey County, all we do is move people for tourism and goods for agriculture and the wine industry that Joel referred to. We actually grow more wine grapes than Napa. We just forgot to tell the world. So soon the Monterey Appellation will be far more important to you than you ever thought. But our ability to catch up, not get ahead, over the next 25 years is contingent upon a 2/3 vote of the people. And frankly, as a mayor who thinks that with tremendous social challenges, at the heart of our ability to solve that is prosperity. At the heart of our ability to be prosperous is to shape the economic battlefield ahead of time, because in California, given our high costs, I'm often distraught when I hear I might be competing for something and then somebody says something like Reno, and they built the warehouse on spec. We don't do things on spec when land costs that much. So it is disconcerting. I generally like democracy, but occasionally, when it comes to things like this, the will of the people can be a little overrated if you've got to rely on them in a place like California, and we've got to explain agriculture, and the voting base is generally urban-oriented. So that's a challenge, and it's a problem. And I'll give you two other quick examples. The fact that we are having any amount of discussion about the need to upgrade our ability to provide infrastructure, dams, and to make sure we don't run out of water because we're protecting some fish is absurd. And I happily signed the Mayor's Climate Protection Act, UN Urban Accords, because I do believe in Monterey County, and one of the things that I think is terribly important right now is we appear to live where we could actually have an actual harmonic convergence between environmental and market forces, if we do it right. But if we stay stuck in our ideological traps, we're not going to get anything done. I always believe, particularly based on what I've seen, a win-win is possible. But our infrastructure and the future of our state is caught up in political battles. Now, the reason that's important, and the reason this is potentially important, is that if you don't have to go to a statewide ballot to solve a local infrastructure problem, the reality is all of a sudden California becomes different. The Central Valley's ability to control its own destiny becomes more possible. In Monterey County, even if you are going to have a food fight, because keep in mind all the folks, once they move into Paradise, once they got there, and then they're going to explain to all the folks who had been there how it really ought to be. But we would have the ability, if you have the project and the financing and the ability to move, the body politic is more likely to respond to, here's the project and here's the money. Example. Because of the current energy situation, it cost us $10 to grow a box of lettuce. And when I was on the desk, it used to cost $4 or $5 to ship it across country. Today it costs $10 to ship it. across country. So in a world that talks about carbon footprints and everybody promotes buying locally, all of a sudden when I have to compete against New Jersey in late July through early October, that freight difference, those high energy costs matter. So in our valley, we are actually seriously contemplating, should everything old be new again? Might the rail actually come back? And if they can move a rail car, instead of me paying $10,000 for a truck, and I've heard two different figures, but the equivalent of $3,000 to $6,000 a truck, that's going to matter. And you can be darn certain rail may be on its way back, but there's a problem. In order to build the types of facilities we need, simple things like an interchange may trip us up, or where do I get available land? How does infrastructure get financed? In a state like ours, where the state is not reliable, in a county like ours, where we have only 460,000 people in the county, and we're a third of it, we can't get to scale. Yet I would contend that if you think about one of the points that Joel made, I can argue, I think, that you can make a case that the Salinas Valley over time, relative to the things we do, because there is a clear distinction has to be made between commodities and perishable items. But if the alternative energy, crops for energy or industry, is going to play out, not necessarily with corn or grains, but instead goes more towards plant material, California becomes more important. That infrastructure becomes more important. Now, my sense is this issue is going to be more expansive. But in all cases, we are going to need the ability to expand our infrastructure, and there are no reliable government actors at the moment. Nationally, it appears to be on everybody's radar. We'll see. The more time I spend around government, the more I am absolutely startled how little anybody is talking about anything really, or how the lack of concern about solving big things, but we're busy on other things, and they're important. But this infrastructure issue is absolutely critical to the future of this country, in my view. And I think the last thing I would say, the ability to do this really matters. At the end of the day, and I think Salinas is a perfect example, I think Western Pennsylvania may have been an example once upon a time, though I know they've transformed themselves. When you see industries leave, economies fundamentally have to be based around somebody's making something. I have no qualms going back to what I said earlier. You really, in our case, even the judge, the lawyer, the accountant, the doctor, they all live off the fact a grower shipper was willing to put millions of dollars in the ground and take a chance that $2 million would come back. Everything flows from that proposition. And so it seems to me that as we look at the very real possibility, and there's no question energy is one of the key things that's going to drive this economy in the future. And I think Joel has got it exactly right. Available land there's no question in my mind, is really linked into that. So even if you're from, and I'm going to guess, North Dakota or Nebraska, politically it may be a little more easier to get it done. But that doesn't necessarily mean the money and the scale is there to get it done. So I will certainly defer to those smarter to me if this is the exact right approach. But I would tell you this notion of it's the best thing I've seen offered as a potential solution for real financing, the ability to put business in play to create opportunity. I'll just quickly close with, I'm a little bit of a disciple of former San Jose Mayor Tom McHenry, who really said, you know, cities have two choices. They either go down the road of trying to kind of be like those old city-states of old, like a Venice. Radicchio growers always refer to Venice. In the sense that you move around the world, promote and try and control your economic destiny. And we don't really have, in rural America or a city like Salinas, we don't really have the scale necessary to do that. Or you rely on Sacramento or Washington to bail you out. That's a non-starter. So if we're all looking to have more control over our economic future, the insertion of this type of idea into our economic dialogue, I would contend, I would certainly support, is the notion is very, very critical for the future of the country. So, thank you.
And under our vision, Salinas, North Dakota, and Nebraska can all win in your win-win world. Right? We have about 20, 25 minutes for questions. I think we have a mic because we're actually being streamed, so please stand up and identify yourself. And
Right. I'm Norm Kurland of Equity Expansion International, and I have a two-sided question. One dealing, I think the idea of financing new growth is essential, and focusing on energy is very key, and infrastructure. The two questions, one is, relates to power, and that is the democratization of economic power, and to what extent the citizens in Salina or any other place that covered by the Heartland will be owners. So that's number one. The other relates to the question of where will the money come from. And it seems to me that you ought to consider Section 13 of the Federal Reserve Act, the discount power, which creates money. It just did it for the billionaire bailout. It creates money to bail out Wall Street speculators. It can be the source of financing through the regional feds, which were set up as development banks originally in 1913, as a source of financing the kind of growth that you're talking about. I think you ought to give that some consideration.
I can hear all the people on the internet rushing out to look up Section 13 right now. But Mayor Donahue, do you want to comment on the democracy question?
Well, you know, it's a good question. One of the things that's interesting, and in my mind, because in the Salinas Valley, and I mentioned the connection with the Silicon Valley, in fact, one of the things we're working with the Silicon Valley joint venture on is a forum next spring where we do the Salinas Valley meets the Silicon Valley. And because if you look how the VCs are lined up, they're interested in all things green, clean, wind, solar, and alternative energy. And this issue of wind in particular, and I'm not getting into anyone's politics when I say this, I'm far more interested in the machinations of the political race than anything else. But when I looked up Sarah Palin, I was kind of intrigued by this permanent fund concept. You know, okay, if the oil's in Alaska and Alaskans get money, how does that work? And I think that notion of, can you look at things, you know, who owns the wind really?
That's right.
Now, I think solar is a little differently because you gotta, I mean, both, but it may or may not be. But that general concept of, should we be looking at that? And frankly, you know, as somebody in my spare time, you know, I'm working on a new grower shipper model of crops for energy or for industry. But as a mayor, in terms of economic development, I think you've asked a superb question, and it ought to be looked at.
Yes, please follow.
Just
Yeah,
additional
please
point,
stand up.
It will be helpful to you. I think you ought to look. I think you ought to look at what's going on in the middle of the country. East St. Louis, one of the poorest cities in the country. 11 mayors have gotten together to form something under Illinois law. It's passed the House by 140 to zero, to set up community investment corporations. They're for-profit, to own the land and infrastructure in that area. The mayor of East St. Louis is the chairman, and I think it might be useful to you. You can find information on that under our nonprofit group called the Center for Economic and Social Justice. It's www.cesj.org.
Thank you.
This gentleman.
Arnold de Borgrave, CSIS. As I look at the economy today, we're borrowing $3 billion a day to maintain the world's highest standard of living based on conspicuous consumption at a time of growing world shortages. That would indicate that a major paradigm shift has to come sooner or later. And to what degree would your plan contribute to this shift?
Yeah, oh, okay. I mean, first of all, I mean, what I'm concerned with is how do we build up our productive economy so we're not borrowing so much money? It's absurd. The United States is an amazingly rich country. We just deploy our assets stupidly and in things that are not very productive. But the fundamentals are still pretty good. We have relatively vibrant demographics. We have lots of natural resources. We have a higher level of technology. There's no natural reason why we should be in that economic situation you're talking about. The second issue, which I think is maybe a little more problematic, but difficult, is you have 100 million more people. Is the paradigm shift that the next 100 million Americans don't live remotely as well as the generation before? And so a lot of our concern is that that does not happen. And I think there are lots of ways to do it, but I don't think you can go to a steady state model, no economic growth, and just redistribute without destroying the middle class and the quality of life of the middle class. And so I think you need both things. You need to have a growth economy that's based on, real, not just borrowing money from people, and also a notion of how do we somehow accommodate this 100 million more people, which is what I've been spending the last 2 years trying to think about.
Yeah, if I may just add a point. One of the other major features of the Economic Growth Program in the New American Foundation is to address how you, in essence, rebalance the global economy, whereby the rest of the world assumes greater responsibility for generating its own consumer demand, because we are at an end of an era of one phase of globalization that was driven and made possible largely by American consumption patterns and American accumulation of debt. The rest of the world has become too comfortable, and indeed, to the extent that anyone has China's the other major growth model. When they develop an active growth strategy, it's often just to reinforce their production-oriented tendencies. And so we have to use this credit and financial crisis not only in essence to build out and reorder our financial institutions, but in essence to rebalance the various sense of duties and responsibilities and growth strategies in the world so that we can actually grow in a more mutually beneficial way rather than the rest of the world relying on the United States to help generate the demand and then willing to lend us the money to finance that demand. So that's why building out the productive economy is to do America's part to be able to generate a different kind of world balancing. We're also working to encourage the rest of the world to think about how they can make their consumers more prosperous, to enjoy more of the fruits of their productivity growth as well, so that we get a better balance in the world economy.
I have a somewhat different perspective on things. I work a lot with manufacturing companies, technology companies, value-added ag companies in the Midwest and elsewhere, and they never got into this bubble mentality, build a company, cash out in 36 months. The people running these companies are running those companies because they love what they do. They're craftsmen, they're engineers. They build companies that have value. They never paradigm shift? Not really. This would be investing in companies that really have something to offer and are very successful now because they're very well managed. They're bootstrapped mostly with local resources, and they've learned to reach out to the global economy because if they didn't reach out, they were in such small markets, they would have died. So I don't view it as a paradigm shift so much as investing in these kinds of companies that are very solid.
Yes. She's bringing the microphone.
I'm from Santa Cruz, so I welcome you here from Salinas.
Heard of that.
I thought that we were going to be, I had an idea that today we were going to be talking more about like manufacturing extension services and those kinds of things that would help the infrastructure. One of my keen interests is helping companies export, and in that regards, qualify for ISO status. And I would like to see, I mean, you all are familiar with the International Standards Organization, which is the international mechanism to recognize the quality and the ability of a company to repeatedly produce the same thing with the same quality standards, which has now become the major thing that is used as a tool in Europe and Asia, and has not really caught on in the United States by any stretch of the imagination as it has in the rest of the world. I wonder what we could do to help companies compete in the international marketplace by facilitating them getting ISO certified.
Well, I don't want to discount that because that is very important. In fact, we have a very strong MEP program in the Dakotas. I've worked very hard on export processing facilities and having the services available for all those sorts of things. Programs to comply with ISO standards. I guess our focus is on the physical assets, but when we start talking about infrasystems, the lines become very blurry because infrasystems are really facilities, technology, and then all those socio-technical things that you're talking about. And you can't have one without the other. And I guess from an investment standpoint, we're more concerned about getting the physical assets in place, but also very keen on making sure that the kinds of things you want to do are there in place as well.
Yeah, and just very briefly, one of the things that I find, not just here, but when I'm in Europe and in Australia and in Canada, is this, and Dennis has been very involved with Heartland College, which is a local college, is trying to get these educational institutions from the high school level up focused on practical skills that they can teach people. I mean, when we first came to Salinas, the community college district had dismantled its agricultural sciences program, yet we were having growers say, well, we can't find people who can fix tractors or work on the irrigation system. So this whole notion of technical training and skills-based training, I think, is one of the big, it is really a paradigm shift. I mean, basically, my sense is a lot of the community colleges were in the factory mode. They were just going to churn out people to get, to go to a four-year college, which they may or may not graduate from. But meanwhile, the academic institutions were getting more and more money. But at the end, the kids were coming out, with, as we used to say in the old days in New York with those, you can ride on the subway, if you have a subway token. But that's about all it was worth. You were getting nothing extra out of it. And I'm particularly concerned, and I think maybe Dennis could comment on this, in a place like Salinas where you have particularly a large population of males who are basically they're either going to be vatos locos or they're going to work at Walmart. I mean, there is no middle ground, any high-end blue-collar skills. And I can tell you, in city after city after city, I almost never find a group of business people say, "Oh God, we really need PhDs," or "God, if we only had more masters of English, it would be great." I mean, what they tell you is, "I can't get welders, can't get machinists." These are good jobs. They're very often union jobs. They're skills, and yet our schools don't pay attention to it. And maybe, Dennis, can you talk a little bit about what's happened at Hartnell, where I think is turning it around a bit?
Well, in the last couple of years, it's actually turned into a success story that the community college will allow us over time to possibly be a multi-college within the same district. But both the local ag and construction folks got together, and we now have under construction a new ag tech center, so we can meet our own internal demand. And then the construction industry has done the same thing, because the reality is within our own pipeline, even before you get to the, if that tax measure were to pass Measure Z, we have, because we'll be going through some urban renewal, so to speak, we have $1 billion of potential construction-related projects in the pipeline. And what a shame if our own community couldn't build them and take advantage of them. So we're rallying, but again, I think what all this points to, this infrastructure need is so critical. If you don't do it now, but when you delay a year, you don't delay a year. So we've had several years to try and pass a tax measure just to catch up for infrastructure. We have no strategic vision of where we want our valley to go to be prosperous, to be ready for the 21st century. So that infrastructure isn't even on the table yet. And again, I think it speaks to the importance of what they're talking about today. If you had to move more quickly, an entity or an instrument like this certainly affords that possibility much more than government.
Right. I want to acknowledge two additional questionnaires. It's a good segue to our next question, and then.
Hi, I'm Robin Hickey, School Biz Match. I'm an educator, and I'm very excited about this whole discussion. Particularly it hits home because I drove from Seattle a year ago to Washington, D.C., and this land is beautiful, and including seeing Mount Rushmore. It's fabulous, Mount Rushmore. I cannot help but, and you all started to bring it up now, thank you, education is part of the infrastructure for any development in any community, and it didn't come out in your fine speeches. And I'm only standing here because all week long and all last week, when Washington is now active again, and all of these lectures are quite prominent, we have not improved in our K-12 system. It is pointed out 2 days ago. Since 1964, we have dropped down in science. Science is now 24 in the world. We're 19th in the world in math. Reading literacy in a city such as Washington, D.C. is 50% at level 3 proficiency, which means 50% of the adults here cannot read past the 3rd grade level. Nationally, 20% cannot read past the 8th grade level. What plans, if any thoughts on how to incorporate those weaknesses in the system? As this physical infrastructure sounds great, it might be, talking about balance, very, very essential at this fundamental level to begin to think about, those human agents that also are producers, revenue producers, being taken care of and can gain those skills, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You know from where I'm coming.
Joe, do you want to make a quick comment on this in light of your, coming from a state and a region where actually public schools do work, myself, in North Dakota and Nebraska, but you're the one who commented on it, so do you want to add anything to this?
It's just well, I'm at the LAUSD, so I mean, it's not the best system in the world. So, but I think that one of the things that we find ourselves doing, because the K-12 system is so poor, is there's a lot of remedial work, and a lot of companies find themselves forced to essentially teach the basic skills to the students who are even theoretically graduate. And so one of the things I think in the infrasystems idea would be a technical training. We're working, for instance, in the city of Ontario, which has got a big industrial base and warehouse base, and they're really focusing a lot both on the K through 12 and also on the, again, the basic skill levels. Because I think what we do in the United States is we're really good at the very high end, and we really don't do very well below then. And that's like a tremendous vulnerability. And that, by the way, that's sometimes a reason why companies decide, you know what, I just can't make this product in the United States, even though I'd like to, but I can't find the reliable workforce to do it.
Before I take the last two questions, I just wanted to make a couple commercials. One on the website you will find Joel and Dolores' earlier report on the Heartland Development Report, which is much longer and more greatly detailed than this short synopsis here. Secondly, I also want to steer you to the paper that Doug and Heidi Redeker have done of Putting the World's Capital Work, which has proposed, I think, a big brother, big sister institution that would operate at a national level, and is very rich in detail, particularly about the availability of private capital and how to structure an infrastructure bank. So also that. Also, I want to note Mike Linz has a very important piece coming out in Democracy, of which he provides, I think, both the historical but also the transformational nature of the role infrastructure has played in relationship to the economy and economic growth over different historical periods. And Mike will be heading up our American Infrastructure Initiative going forward. So all of those will be available. If they're not available on our website, I wanted to get, sorry for the commercial nature of our promoting our materials, but I just wanted to make you aware of the other resources that are available. We have approximately about 2 or 3 minutes left, so we'll get these last two questions or comments in. Thank you.
I'm Charles Cleland from USDA, and I just have a general question about how we finance certain types of infrastructure. I was last night hearing about chicken farmers in the eastern shore of Maryland trying to export chicken feet, which apparently are a real delicacy in China. But there are no shipping, there's no boats available, no shipping containers available. Now, is that something that's going to be, and you mentioned about exporting lettuce out of Salinas, and of course I suspect rail cars are a real premium. Now, are those going to have to be built by the railroad companies and the shipping companies, or are they to be financed through some, you mentioned something about an infrastructure, national infrastructure bank in your piece.
Yeah.
So I'm curious where you think that kind of financing is going to come from.
Well, I think that's something we would definitely look at with the Heartland Bank. If that's a need that's, serving as a barrier to that happening, I think we'd take a look at it. But that would involve building the shipping containers as well as finding the ship, right? Now, that ship might be a little outside the bounds, but well, I could think about that. Dennis, you
Maybe just getting the spur.
Well, I think the lettuce example of that might be, I mean, Dolores is right. I mean, just right off the top of my head, because I've put things on boats and brought things in from Chile. I mean, the shipping lanes may not work, so that may be the non-starter right there. But for instance, the FDA just said, and this is, that irradiation's okay. It was a complete non-event in Salinas because it's just cost prohibitive. Nobody's even thinking about that now. So that type of facility might represent industry infrastructure towards a desired food safety outcome, but it is absolutely cost prohibitive for a company, even if you were beyond the consumer acceptance point, to do that. And one of the examples I always cite is if you know, in a former life when I worked for Fresh Express, the cut pineapple was my project. So I was over in Maui and I snuck over to see the papaya folks. Hawaii is a veritable paradise in the garden in the middle of the Pacific, but for the sake of they ship bugs. So there's papaya, there's a critical opportunity, yet nobody's building an irradiation facility. So the reality is, the answer is somebody else. but if it's not government and if it's not the producer, who? And then until you figure out that answer, we don't get to over to critical mass. So it's a thorny issue, but that's why I think this is intriguing, because again, with so many of these things, and today we're talking about infrastructure. The education question is interesting, and I think there's some answers to it. But the behind the line element of all this, and if you're in government, you know this, and I believe in government and I like government, but it doesn't really work and is responsive in times that you need to move quickly. I think we can all agree battleships are not speedboats. So if we can introduce that element into creating new opportunity, that's important.
Yeah, in the particular case that you mentioned, I would presume that the market and the shipping would eventually, there is a great pressure on availability of ships. I suspect there's enough prominent shipping companies that have diversity of business that will eventually respond to market demand. I think there's other cases where part of the problem, and it relates to railroads and airports, where the confusion about where public and private responsibilities begin and end is creating enormous infrastructure bottlenecks. And I think this is where the bank in particular might be able, the private carriers and railroads don't want to make those investments. The government doesn't see it clearly. It's its responsibility, particularly in light of other pressing needs. A bank that comes in then that can actually operate somewhat like an investment bank as well, and meaning getting government and private carriers together to make a project happen, I think is an underutilized, is part of that layer of financial institutions that we're talking about.
That's exactly what we do with our programs. We get private companies or community organizations to come in partnership with people.
Thank you. I'm Peggy Siegel. I'm an education free agent. I just had a thought in terms of the infrastructure that you are building. Yesterday, post 9/11, both presidential candidates are now talking about how to organize volunteerism that's been welling up since 9/11. And I'm wondering if you see any opportunities, as that is coming from all parts of the country. People want to get engaged from a human capital standpoint, whether the infrastructure that you're building provides a platform to both elevate that conversation and reframe it, to be able to have participation around infrastructure issues for the country and globally. And I'd love your thoughts.
I don't think it solves the financial problem. I think what it may address, and this ties in a little bit to what you were talking about in terms of education, in the sense, I also happen to be the mayor of a city with a very difficult gang problem. So we think a lot about how do we create upward mobility, positive alternatives for young people, and all that ties into trades. If you don't, just long story short, one of the things that contributes to, if you believe you have no opportunities or future, you tend to often people make different decisions. So, if you think back to that New Deal imagery that's already been mentioned here in terms of putting folks to work, because that's part of what was going on with the New Deal, putting folks to work in terms of labor and infrastructure, and that part's all good. But frankly, I'm going to guess it doesn't get at the financing piece that's really an important element of all this. But on the other hand, it can, depending upon how you do it, for instance, in our city, we're dealing with, all of a sudden I've got to find a quick $4 or $5 million. And so we look at our public works department that's been decimated over the years, and do we owe the public? No, you really need to understand we're operating at 50% of capacity, and by the way, they really just do get benefits. That's how it works. Or am I interested in a conservation corps that allows me to work not at prevailing wage, but provide the same services for the public? Now, could that same model be used to build things? So it's an interesting question, but I doubt if it gets you over the hump, though keeping your labor costs down helps. that makes nobody happy, especially if you're the labor. But
We've run a few minutes over, so I know all of you have important work to do, but I want to, in closing, want to thank Mayor Donahue, Joel Kotkin, and Dolores Zimmerman again for the contribution they made today. Thank you.